turns out that once you get into the space program, this is all standard knowledge. ETs are all over the place. There's lots and lots of groups that have come to the Earth, but they all follow something that in Star Trek was called the Prime Directive. They're not allowed to show us that they exist because it would interfere with free will. We need to think that we're alone and isolated and that there's no God and that there's no extraterrestrials and that we're just trying to figure this thing out in the dark. Because if we knew that they existed, what would happen? We'd fall to our knees and worship them as gods, and we wouldn't be having the opportunity to cry at night in the dark, oh, nobody loves me and there's no universe. There's no higher beings. I'm just all alone. No, you're not alone. But you have an illusion that's been constructed that a lot of ETs are doing a lot of work to uphold, and that illusion maintains the idea of separation. It's a good thing that we have the opportunity to feel pain. It's a good thing that we have the opportunity to not know the truth, because then there's plenty of things to learn. If we learned all this stuff a long time ago, it would get boring. So as you discover these things, it's all these ahas, all these cosmic moments, and remember, the choice has to be made in the dark. The choice of, are you going to love people, or are you going to try to manipulate people and control them for your own gain? That's what the Law of One says the point of being in our reality is. You got to make that choice. So this, again, is all stuff that comes out of the Law of One material, and now it has been heavily validated by what we've heard. Now, the Law of One doesn't quite say this in so many words, but here's what we have heard. Now, this information actually came to me in part through the highest level insider who's been talking to Richard C. Hoagland, who's been out there ever since the 80s talking about all this stuff. And this guy actually was authorized by the United States government to leak this to me and other people who are out there as UFO figures, because apparently the powers that were now feel that it's time for us to know this. And I've taken the ball and run with it. And then after he gave me all this information, these two brand new insiders from the space program showed up, and between them and all of their friends, I got a lot more than what Hoagland's insider was willing to give me. So here's the story from Hoagland's insider, who's been talking to Hoagland ever since he showed up in the 80s. And everybody else, I've put it all together, and these are people who, overall, there's up to 100 different points of correlation between these different stories. And I withhold a lot from the internet, because there are unscrupulous individuals out there who will take this and say that they're insiders and then want to go out there and bilk people out of their money and say, well, you know, I'm going to do this for you, I'm going to do that for you, buy into the bonds that will be worth something when the Federal Reserve collapses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I have to withhold a lot of stuff, because otherwise everybody's going to say they know it, and how can I vet people out? So I've vetted out these guys, and I've not released most of what they said. This is a big new data download. And so we're going to look from here on out and see how many people all of a sudden know all the things that I just told you tonight. Right? That's going to be a telling clue of whether they're real or not. They suddenly change the story. What do we find out? We find out that because of the unique nurturing energy that's in our solar system, this is used as a sort of a rehab colony for negative groups. They were banished here by ETs from other worlds, other solar systems out there, that said, you guys are too warlike, get the heck out of here, we're sending you over there to rehabilitate. We're going to put you on a nice desert island. So we're Australia, we're Botany Bay, okay? Our solar system was a prison colony. Now they didn't, the good beings that did this didn't think of it that way, but the people who got sent here had a lot of enemies, and they pissed a lot of people off. Now, these original people had spent many, many, many millennia in space. And the longer you stay in space as a human being, because one of the things we learn is that everybody that is an extraterrestrial is some kind of hominid. They got a head, they got arms and legs. They could look a lot different than us. Every type of life that we see on Earth, whether it's birds, whether it's fish, whether it's reptiles, insects, every type of life on Earth has beings that look human or human-like that are derived from that type of life. So you have avian humans, you have simian humans that actually look more like monkeys than we do, you have some that have faces like felines, some that have faces like birds. They actually look like a bird head on a human body. Some of them look like reptilian heads on human bodies. Some of them have insect heads on human bodies. All these different types are out there. And it seems that different types that look more alike tend to stick together more. And that includes the reptilians, which happen to be the bad guys in the story. It sounds cliche, it just happens to be true. So these people have been floating around in the cosmos for a really long time, and they got very highly evolved to such an extent that they communicate by microvoltage changes in the glow on their face that's like broadband internet. So they can communicate much faster than speaking. And that's why for people like us to try to talk to these guys, it's almost impossible. They can't even imagine trying to speak in regular speech like at the speed that we do. It would be way too slow. So here's a list. That guy down there on the bottom left is us. That's 6, means 6 feet in height. These are all different types of giant skeletons that have been found on Earth in terms of their heights. Goes up to 36 feet. So there have been certain burial sites in which 36-foot skeletons have been found. One of the insiders I just met actually got to talk to one of these giants and found out that there are 3 different major types of giant species that came to the planet from 3 different locations. There's a group that's in the sort of 7 to 9 foot range. There's a group that's in the sort of 12 to 13 foot range. And then there's a group that's around the 36 foot range, and if you see ones that are shorter than that, they're most likely children of the adults. Now, there's the different lineup of what we got. So you could see some of these giants would be extremely tall and threatening to us as little guys there on the left. But now these folks are called in the insider world, the world of the Illuminati, they call them the progenitors. Those are the guys that are 70 to 100 feet tall. That would be a 70-foot humanoid there on the right. And there is us. Now, what I'm telling you is, yeah, everybody's standing up. You see that? It's a dramatic moment. I love it. That little pipsqueak over there on the left is the height that we have now. Now imagine that our space program, we start building ships that can travel out of the solar system. You know that they exist. You know that they got the Roswell crash, right? You know they reverse engineered it. You know about Area 51. Don't you think they'd fly into space? Don't you think they'd want to see some stuff out there once they got out there? Guess what they found? They found all kinds of build-outs inside moons and inside asteroids predominantly, where the entire room is built for people that are that large. Now imagine walking into a room where the countertops alone are like 40 feet high, and the windows are up above where the countertops are. For whatever reason, most of the stuff that we've found apparently has had a lot of it cleared out. All the original equipment has been removed, probably because of scavengers, bone pickers. So a lot of what we find out there is big, giant, empty rooms that are massive in size with very massive doors that are like 100 feet tall. There's still, in some cases, machines that still work inside these facilities built by these very large extraterrestrials they call the progenitors. Now what we know is that the progenitors came in from the exterior of our solar system. So the oldest stuff with the tallest people is in places like the Oort cloud outside Neptune and Pluto. And then they started to settle in the moons of Neptune, Pluto, and the gas giants there. And they worked their way in over time. So here's the sun accurately sized relevant to the planets. And they moved their way in. As I've been saying, the majority, according to the insiders I've spoken to, the majority of all the moons in our solar system have some degree of ancient bases inside them for people that are very, very tall. And in many cases, those bases have then been reoccupied later on. Because beings like these progenitors will come through and they'll build things out, they'll live here for a while, and then they mothball it and they go somewhere else. And then maybe for them, what might be just a few years, for us could be millions of years, they eventually come back and they reoccupy the facility again. So these facilities are ready to go. So in a lot of cases, we just fly in and we start building out what's already been built there, and it saves us an awful lot of time. So these are some selected moons of our solar system with the Earth there placed for scale. You can see there's some really large stuff. The moons of Jupiter, Io, Europa, Ganymede, Callisto, pretty large. And you can see Saturn has a bunch of really large moons in the middle there. Uranus has several really large moons. Neptune has one really big one called Titan. And then you have some asteroids that are pretty large, et cetera, et cetera. So let's start from how our progenitors, as they're called, came in. They came in, and Neptune has a moon system, which I'm showing you now. And this is just to give you the sense of some of the stuff that's out there. All these different moons, or at least most of them from what I've been told from different people, and I got to combine it all together, most of these moons have settlements on them. Gigantic rooms inside. Uranus has a very robust moon system. Tons of moons around Uranus. They even just found 2 new ones, as you can see in this diagram. And a lot of these moons apparently have bases inside them of some magnitude. And these are some of the larger moons of Uranus. Again, probably extensive facilities inside most of these places. Now, Uranus's moon Miranda is a very curious example in which perhaps some of the ancient build-out is still visible to us, because do you notice that strange boomerang shape on the moon? Do you see that? Well, let's take a closer look at that. That's actually what we see. That is Miranda. So there is something very bizarre there. Here it is tilted on a different angle. Now, this looks like it could, that is a ridge or an escarpment that you're seeing there on the left. It's the tallest ridge in the solar system of any of the moons. There's a clear geometric structure there, which you can see based on the triangles that I put in on the right. Now, is it possible that we are seeing the underlying geometric structure that was built inside this moon, and that over the millennia, as the dust has gotten worn off by asteroid collisions, we're starting to see the superstructure that's hidden inside? And also over here, we see very clear geometric shapes. Again, why wouldn't they build a geodesic inside? Now, this is what I've been told by one of the insiders, one of the original insiders, was that some of these moons, the entire inside has an atmosphere. And there is something like a geometric object, like those platonic solids, and you actually see trees and lakes, and there's an artificial sun, and you can fly around inside that moon, and you can pilot the moon anywhere you want to go, and it's like a whole world built inside of it. That's an advanced, obviously very advanced technology that apparently is all over the place. Now, Saturn has a whole bunch of moons. Look at all these moons. And as I said, probably the majority, based on what many insiders have told me, the majority of these moons have some kind of build-out in them already. And we have been out there and investigated a majority of this and looked for what we can find. Now, Saturn's moon Mimas, which is sort of closer to it, meaning it's going to be warmer there, is a curiously similar shape to the Death Star, and this was actually mentioned by the Daily Mail, which is probably part of a programmed disclosure. Now, you see that it actually looks a lot like something that George Lucas put into his movie. How did he get this idea? Well, maybe he got it from somebody on the inside, because it looks pretty darn similar. And remember, this is most likely an artificial world inside something that looks like a moon, which is exactly what the Death Star was in Star Wars. It even has similar structures on the surface. And if that's not weird enough, based on any conventional knowledge of physics, what we should see inside that moon is that the heat is going to be the strongest on the part of the moon that faces the planet, right? So that the planet's radiant heat is warming up the moon there. What we actually see is exactly the opposite. We see that the part that's facing Saturn is colder, and the part away from Saturn is warmer. And look at how it's got this sort of Pac-Man shape. Now imagine, if you will, that this is one of those moons that has an entire civilization already built inside of it, and everybody is living inside the yellow part. And then most of the hollow interior of the moon would be the sky for them. And then where that circle is, as you can see on the bottom, would be approximately where the sun, the fake sun, would be. You could have a whole world of people living inside this object, hiding from their enemies. because these people, remember, were a prison colony. They were in trouble, and they were sent here to reform, and they also had enemies, and they were really worried about being attacked. So then we have another moon around Saturn that also has this very strange temperature anomaly. Same thing, Tethys. Again, it doesn't seem to make sense, but maybe one explanation is that this is where the civilization is, and that it's still in operation. Apparently there's a lot of people here in our solar system even now. And so the mainstream media, of course, calls it Pac-Man, right? Just to try to make light of it, but then they're getting you to ask questions. And Blinky is nowhere to be seen. Oh my goodness gracious. Now also around Saturn we have Enceladus, and this also is a very, very curious thing. Now on the left, we're going to come back to this in a little while, is a weird square that's on the moon, but then the one on the right is this weird square that's on Saturn's moon Enceladus. Squares are not supposed to show up in nature, but it would be something you'd expect to see in the case of an ancient geometric build-out. So that's very curious. Now, what happens when we look at this curiously square area? Well, the curiously square area has curious heat that's not supposed to be there in exactly the square shape. You see that down there on the bottom right? And then, it's not what's supposed to be there. When we look at it up close, it has a striated structure, which would totally be what you'd expect if this particular habitat is built to have a series of long hallways so that everybody gets windows. So that it's not all just one big giant room, but that you have these developments. Now that looks like an artificial and intelligently built structure to me, because you got straight lines and 90-degree turns, suggesting a massive, massive station has been built inside, and it's down at the polar region, and that's where all the heat is, because that's where everybody's keeping the bills paid and keeping the heat on. Now, one of the insiders, when I showed this to him, he told me that that image looks exactly like what we see when we use various classified means such as LIDAR, radar, and thermal collage to look at actual underground facilities here on Earth. It's a very, very similar pattern to the underground bases that we have. Now, Saturn also has another moon, Iapetus, that has some weird stuff going on, and it's the one that is, let me make sure I'm right here, yep. It's the one that's on that really, really wide arc, so it goes far away from Saturn, as you can see right here. There's Iapetus. Now, this is some photographs that were taken from Cassini, which swung by several years ago, and this was work done by Richard Hoagland back in 2006, where he looks at Iapetus and says, oh my gosh, it's not a perfect sphere, it's all funny looking, and it has this ridge exactly along the midpoint, along the equator. What the heck is that thing doing there? Moons are not supposed to have a gigantic ridge that goes across the entire central axis of the middle of the planet, but if you superimpose your latitude and longitude lines, it's right there. That is exactly what we would expect if this thing has been built like a clamshell that's got two halves and it's all artificial inside, okay? So that's not something we would expect, and there's even more weird fringe benefits with this moon. When we look at how the sun reflects across its surface, we see very strange geometric oddities. It is not a nice smooth curve. It's got geometric straight line dents on it. Check that out. I was really impressed with Richard when he did this, and I think that the insider guy that I'm in contact with leaked some of this to him, as well as him doing it through his own work. So you can see that there is a geometric structure, almost like, because it's so old, that it's kind of collapsed in on itself, and the original parts of the moon that were all dust have probably blown away or gotten impacted by asteroid collisions, things like that. And then as the sunlight plays across the surface of Iapetus, which, remember, still has that central equator as well, you see different types of straight line geometry. That is not what it should look like. But that is what we would expect if it's a gigantic base of massive proportions, like the Death Star, which was being rebuilt in Return of the Jedi. So there it is again. Now, this was Richard's conception of what it might look like inside, underneath all the dirt. And I don't think that's too far from the truth. I think that's basically what these look like, and that was what he was nudged to think by the insider. And the idea here is that at some point, this group, which probably had a population of hundreds of billions of people at the apex of their civilization, their enemies came back and they got wiped out. Now, another thing I want to show you before we get into that story is this particular asteroid. It's very compelling, 433 Eros. It's kind of shaped like a potato. And this is from February 14th, 2000. And what we're going to see here is a NASA page, September 26, 2000, called Square Craters. Oh, right, yeah, because asteroids have square craters. No, they don't. They're not supposed to. But look at what we're seeing here. You can actually see at least 4 very clear squares in a straight line. Now think about what this probably means. These are gigantic square rooms built for people, because remember, look at the scale there. That's 500 meters. So these are really, really large, because remember, a meter is 3 feet. So we're looking at 1,500 feet across, and actually more than that. So these are like 2,000 feet across, these 2 large squares from one side to the other. So we're dealing with almost, it's about a half a mile wide from one side to the other inside these squares. That's a big frickin' room. But if you're 70 foot tall, it's not going to be as big. And what probably has happened is that over the millennia, the roof has collapsed in on these facilities. So now you're seeing a totally abnormal, non-natural square geometry. And if you look there on the right, you see there's 2 more little squares as well that also appear to be artificial in nature. And those are just the most obvious ones that they're allowing us to see. Now Mars, apparently, also the moons Phobos and Deimos are totally hollow inside, and that's why they look so lumpy, because they have really collapsed over time, because most of that hollowness hasn't supported the external structure. So originally they were more round, and they've sort of collapsed. This apparently at one time was like a holding facility or a base that had, it was like a hangar for large amounts of aircraft, a very large size, that were stored inside of it. Now notice here, you see these geometric striations. You see vertical lines going top to bottom, and then vertical lines going left to right, and they're at 9-degree angles. That is probably the remainder of the original superstructure that was holding it all together. And that original superstructure, again, is just showing up as some of the stress lines and stress marks that we see on this moon. So you can kind of see now the 9-degree angles of the original, the ribbing. These are the original supports that were built inside before it shrank. Now this is really bizarre. According to the insiders I'm in contact with, the ancient progenitors built out the inside of Phobos, and then more recent ET groups have colonized our solar system, and this was one of the first places they went, because they could see right away by looking with the penetrating radar inside that it was all hollow and that it's square inside. And in fact, European Space Agency, ESA, had found that same data through some of their space probes, and they told Richard Hoagland, they leaked it to him before they went public with it, and then of course the whole story got silenced and suppressed, and you never heard about it again. Buzz Aldrin, one of the Apollo astronauts, mentioned that there was a monolith on Phobos on C-SPAN. And this is a shot from that actual clip. I'm not going to play it here, but you can watch it on YouTube. And he says, what if we go back to Phobos and try to find out what this thing is? Well, there it is down there on the bottom. Look at the long shadow that this thing is casting. That shouldn't be there. And this is Efren Palermo, one of Hoagland's old associates, showing how this monolith would have been casting that shadow. And this was his drawing of, or actually a mock-up, a photograph of what he thinks it originally must look like. Now, again, what we've heard from insiders is that this was something built by newer groups that were a lot shorter than 70 feet tall, that came in and used that as a basic door that they could find to try to get inside the thing. This was where they would land and where they had their equipment and so forth. And probably has it's like a whole skyscraper type of thing they built on there. with all different rooms and stuff inside of it. I don't think it really looks like this. It's probably a lot more technological. And of course, this brings us to the infamous monuments of Mars, which appear to be some of the survivors of what we're going to see became the asteroid belt. And after that, which was originally a planet, that's one of the things everybody on the inside tells you, is there was a super Earth in our solar system. Now, some people call it Electra, some people call it Tiamat. That's the two different names for it I've heard from the space program. After this planet exploded, and we'll get to that in a minute, the survivors apparently settled on Mars. And Mars had been largely damaged because Mars was an Earth-like moon orbiting this super-Earth, but it still had enough ocean and atmosphere left that it could be lived on, predominantly through underground bases, and they were able to rebuild it for a while and built up a civilization. Now, this is the original picture from NASA frame 35A16, I believe it is, or 35A73, that shows what appears to be a face. And this has been widely attacked, but as you can see here, it clearly is casting a shadow. It looks very much like a face with a headdress on it. And then, as this is one of Hoagland's, he just basically cropped around the original NASA photograph. You see the face over there on the right, which very much looks like a face, and then on the left, we have this whole crazy-looking city of things that look very much like pyramids. Now let's take a closer look at that. That, to me, is very much not a natural formation. So this is the result of people building pyramids, and then, as I showed you in the previous slide, the face is right over there, right where the sun sets. So they could watch the sunset over this monument, which is probably a monument to one of their leaders. So in 1998, Mark Carlotto did a geometric projection from the side where you can actually see really clearly the huge structure of that face, which, again, is very obviously an intelligently built structure. And then you got this city of pyramids. And then notice what you got over there on the bottom right. There is another pyramid down there that's actually 5-sided. You can see it here in this picture, not very well, but it's right down there in the middle. So let's take a look at that one now. That's what it looks like from the top view, and that's what it looks like from the side. Again, this object, they estimate, is 1.5 miles wide. It's enormous, and it's big enough that it could potentially hold 1 billion people inside. It's a very, very large facility that probably originally was quite a beautiful glass-like structure. The space program people have traveled to the face on Mars, to the pyramids on Mars, and from what they've told me, these structures are there, but they are under a great deal of sediment. There was a massive catastrophe that hit Mars that wiped them out, and that is described in the Law of One as having happened approximately 200,000 of our years ago. And the planet that exploded, they said, was more like 800,000 years ago. So it's interesting to note that the shape of this 5-sided pyramid has the human proportion built into it, suggesting it was built by humans who look like us. Because there's the Vitruvian Man that just drops right in perfectly into the shape of that pyramid. Isn't that interesting? There's all kinds of very strange and wonderful mathematical relationships between this 5-sided pyramid and the surrounding geometry on the plateau. I'm not going to bore you with all that, and we don't have enough time. That's Richard Hoagland's thing. I highly recommend reading his book, The Monuments of Mars, because that is the best source for all of that information. Then NASA comes out in 1998 and tries to debunk this whole thing by releasing what Art Bell called the cat box, in which they washed out the blacks and whites, they washed out the contrast, and sent us this image on the left to say, oh, all these people that think it's a face, they don't know what they're looking at. That was disinformation, folks. That thing on the left doesn't look anything like what I showed you and the very beautiful shadows that it cast on the original NASA slides. Why? Because they don't want us to know that they already have a base on Mars. They've had it since the Nazis originally